We celebrate the boy who lived, but we never speak about the boy who was supposed to die in his place. Neville Longbottom wasn't just overlooked. He was the prophecy's second choice, the spare son fate considered and then discarded. And unlike Harry Potter, who was wrapped in legend and love, Neville grew up knowing that his parents were still alive, locked in a hospital wing, staring at him with empty eyes that no longer recognized their own child. This isn't a story about heroism. It's about what happens to a child when the universe almost chooses him for greatness, then walks away. It's about growing up in the shadow of a destiny that was never quite yours, watching another boy carry the weight you were spared from, and wondering every single day if you were saved or simply deemed unworthy. Neville Longbottom's life is a study in biological fear, inherited trauma, and the quiet agony of being the boy who almost mattered. The prophecy spoke of a child born at the end of July to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. 2 boys fit that description: Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom. Both were marked by fate. Both were potential targets, but Voldemort chose Harry. And in that choice, he saved Neville from a lightning scar and condemned him to something worse: irrelevance. Because at least Harry's suffering came with purpose. At least Harry's pain meant something. Neville's pain was just pain, inherited from parents who couldn't even speak his name anymore. Frank and Alice Longbottom were Aurors, war heroes who stood against the Death Eaters with the kind of courage that gets you remembered in history books. But courage doesn't protect you from the Cruciatus curse. After Voldemort fell, after the war was supposed to be over, they were captured, tortured. Bellatrix Lestrange broke their minds so thoroughly that death would have been kinder. And Neville, barely more than a year old, was left with the kind of inheritance no child should carry. Not money, not legacy, just the knowledge that his parents were alive in a way that was worse than death. Every visit to St. Mungo's was a reminder. Other children went to hospitals to see loved ones recover. Neville went to watch his mother hand him candy wrappers like they were gifts, her eyes glazed and distant, her mind shattered into pieces that would never fit back together. He would sit there, a child among the ruins of the people who were supposed to raise him, and he would try to smile. Because what else do you do when your mother looks at you like a stranger, and your father doesn't look at you at all? You learn to swallow it. You learn that some kinds of grief don't get to be loud. His grandmother raised him, and she raised him hard. Augusta Longbottom loved her grandson, but love in the Longbottom house came with expectations. She had lost her son and daughter-in-law to the war, and in Neville, she saw one last chance to preserve the family name. She wanted him to be like his father, brave, talented, strong. But Neville was none of those things, not yet. And every time he failed to live up to the legacy, every time his magic faltered or his courage wavered, he could see the disappointment in her eyes. It wasn't cruelty. It was worse. It was the slow, crushing realization that he wasn't enough. They gave him his father's wand. A wand that had chosen another man, in another time, for another destiny. And Neville tried to make it work. He tried to force his magic through a tool that was never meant for him. And when it didn't respond, when his spells misfired, and his professors sighed and his classmates laughed, he internalized it. He believed he was broken. Because if you grow up being told you come from greatness, and you can't even cast a simple charm, what else are you supposed to think? Hogwarts should have been an escape. For most children it was. A castle full of magic and wonder, a place where you could become someone new. But for Neville, it was just another stage for failure. He arrived with a toad instead of an owl, a hand-me-down robe, and a legacy he couldn't live up to. And in his very first week, he met Harry Potter, the boy who actually mattered, the boy the prophecy had chosen. And Neville, kind and eager to belong, never resented him for it. He just quietly accepted that some people were born to be heroes, and some people were born to watch. Snape saw him and chose cruelty. Not because Neville was defiant, but because he was weak, and weakness in Snape's classroom was unforgivable. Every insult, every public humiliation, every time Neville's potion exploded or his hands shook too much to cut an ingredient properly, Snape was there to remind him that he didn't belong. And the worst part was that Neville believed him. Because when everyone from your grandmother to your professors to your classmates treats you like you're a burden, you start to think maybe you are. But here's what no one talks about. Neville wasn't clumsy because he was stupid. He was clumsy because he was terrified. Fear does that. It lives in your body. It makes your hands shake. It makes you second-guess every move. It turns even simple tasks into minefields because you're so afraid of failing again that failure becomes inevitable. And Neville had spent his entire childhood afraid. Afraid of disappointing his grandmother. Afraid of dishonoring his parents. Afraid that he was proof the Longbottom name had finally run dry. He carried a remember-all everywhere, a little glass ball that glowed red when you forgot something, and it was always glowing. Not because Neville was forgetful, but because he had been taught that he couldn't trust himself. He had internalized the idea that he was broken, and so he needed external tools just to function. That's not clumsiness, that's trauma. That's what happens when a child grows up believing that his very existence is a disappointment. And then there was the boggart, third year, defense against the dark arts, and they were learning to face their fears. For most students, it was spiders or clowns or failing an exam. For Neville, it was Snape. Not Voldemort, not death, not even the people who tortured his parents. Just Snape. A teacher. Because the thing Neville feared most wasn't some distant evil. It was the daily, grinding cruelty of being told he wasn't good enough. That's the fear that stays with you. That's the fear that reshapes your nervous system. But something changed in fifth year. Dumbledore's army. A secret group, led by Harry, teaching real defensive magic because the ministry had decided that children didn't need to know how to protect themselves. And Neville joined. Not because he thought he'd be good at it, but because for the first time, someone was offering him a chance to fight back. And slowly, painfully, he started to improve. Not because his magic suddenly got stronger, but because someone finally believed he could do it. Harry saw him, really saw him. Not as a joke or a burden, but as someone worth teaching. And that made all the difference. Because Neville had spent his entire life being told he was a waste of potential. And here was the chosen one, the boy everyone looked up to, treating him like an equal. It didn't erase the years of doubt. It didn't undo the damage. But it gave him something to hold on to. It gave him proof that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as broken as everyone said. The Department of Mysteries was his first real test. A battle in the depths of the Ministry, Death Eaters on all sides, and Neville fought. He fought even when his nose was broken, even when he could barely stand, even when every instinct told him to run. Because this wasn't about prophecy anymore. This wasn't about being chosen. This was about the people who had destroyed his parents. And for the first time in his life, Neville had a chance to fight back. He didn't win. He didn't save the day. But he stayed, and that mattered. Sixth year, the world fell apart. Dumbledore died, Voldemort returned, and Hogwarts became a prison. The Death Eaters took over, led by Snape, and they turned the school into a training ground for cruelty. Students were tortured for disobedience. Muggleborns were hunted. And Neville, the boy who had spent his entire life afraid, became a rebel. He reformed Dumbledore's army. He protected the younger students. He stood up to the Carrows, even when it meant being beaten, even when it meant pain. Because he had finally understood something. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it. They tried to break him. They carved wounds into his skin, used the Cruciatus curse on him, the same curse that had destroyed his parents. And Neville endured it. Not because he was stronger than them, but because he had already lived through the worst kind of pain. He had spent 17 years watching his parents exist as shells. He had spent 17 years being told he wasn't enough. Compared to that, physical pain was almost easy. The final battle came, and Neville was there. Not as a sidekick, not as comic relief, but as a soldier. When Voldemort demanded surrender, when the Order seemed defeated, when Harry Potter was believed dead, Neville stepped forward. He limped out of the crowd, bloody and burned, the sorting hat on his head, and he told Voldemort no. And in that moment, the boy who was almost chosen finally chose himself. He pulled the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and killed Nagini, the last Horcrux, the final piece of Voldemort's soul. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't the final duel, but it was essential. Because without Neville, Voldemort would have been immortal. Without Neville, Harry's sacrifice would have meant nothing. The boy who was supposed to be irrelevant ended up being the one who made victory possible. But here's the part no one talks about. After the war, Harry became a legend. Statues were built, stories were told. The boy who lived got his happily ever after. And Neville went back to teaching herbology at Hogwarts. A quiet life. A humble life. The kind of life that doesn't get remembered in history books. Because that's the truth about the boy who almost was. He saved the world, and the world moved on without thanking him. Neville Longbottom's story isn't about destiny. It's about what happens when destiny forgets you. It's about the children who grow up in the wreckage of a war they didn't start, carrying trauma they didn't choose, and somehow finding the strength to stand anyway. He wasn't the chosen one. He was just a boy who refused to stay broken. And maybe that's harder. Maybe that's braver. Because chosen ones get prophecies and legends and support. Neville just had himself, and in the end, that was enough.